This is the 1968 in Comix panel, and yeah, this is the 1968 in Comix panel, and I did not just pick that year because it just happened to be 50 years since 1968. I picked it because it was a pretty momentous year in comics, but if you're going to talk about comics, of course, you actually have to talk about the world. So I'm going to go through kind of I've encapsulated the entire year 1968 plus the entire 60s in a short PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to show it after these folks introduce themselves. I'm Danny Fingeroth. I was an editor and writer at Marvel Comics for many years. These days I consult on stuff like the Marvel exhibition that's at the Mopop in Seattle. I'll be traveling hopefully to a city near you soon. I work with the Will Eisner Studios, and a bunch of people here are Eisner related in one way or another. So I'm going to go through a little bit of history. There'll be some kibitzing from the panel, and then we'll do some Q&A and talking, and we'll hear from you. But 1968 was a pretty momentous year, and I'm sure that whatever we cover, some of you will know what we didn't cover, what we covered wrong. But anyway, so that's me. But starting our panel at the end is Mr. Denis Kitchen. Denis, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, I guess I'm here because 1968 I was an underground cartoonist. I, after that, evolved into an underground comics publisher and a few other hats, but that's my context for here.
Thank you. And just to make it really confusing, there's another Denis, but that's Denis with two N's. Denis Kitchen is one N. Denis
I'm the one who spells it right.
He's the one who spells it right. So maybe we'll call you Denny if that's okay for the duration of this panel. Mr. O'Neill. Oh, maybe Mr. O'Neill. Mr. O'Neill, can you tell us, encapsulate your 60-year career in 15 seconds?
Yeah.
He's Denny O'Neill.
I stumbled into so many of you guys and people I know grew up wanting to be comic book people. I was a journalist who had managed to alienate virtually everybody who was an authority figure in the small town where I was working. This is a very ultra-conservative town. I was there 4 years ago, really right-wing. And I wrote a phony Associated Press release about how Martin Luther King was coming to Cape Girardeau and going to do some demonstrating, and I slipped that onto the clipboard that all the cops had to read before going on duty. Then I went around about my beat, hospitals, firehouses, got back to the office, and the guy across the street who worked for one of the two radio stations said, I don't know if you had anything to do with that Martin Luther King business, and I don't want to know. But what if you did, don't admit it. Whatever you do not admit it. So I went about my day, and I was walking back to the little shack I rented, and there was the chief of detectives coming out. He had, thank God, none of my hippie friends left any deadly drugs there. And I was taken off the beat the next day, but at that point, a week earlier, I had taken the famous Stanley writers exam contest thing. And so just as I had alienated everybody in Cape Girardeau and was surely about to lose my job. Oh, yeah. Along came Stan and Roy riding over the hilltop with a job for me. It was mine if I wanted to show up and take it. So I went to that for really want of anything better to do, though you have to admit that if you're a beat reporter in a small conservative Missouri town and somebody says, you want to come to New York and write comic books, which of us would not have accepted that? So at 10 o'clock at night, the woman's page editor packed my car, and I didn't know where I was going. I thought, Boston, where my girlfriend is, that way. It's a big town. I am sure to run into it if I drive in that direction. And the car spewed its innards all over an Ohio highway the next day. But we had adventures. I'm going to cut this short and say that that was 51 years ago. I cannot imagine a better job than the one I have had for the last half century. It has been absolutely wonderful. You fans have given me the best life I could hope to have. At first it was a
Danny,
job
I gotta ask you, we'll get back, but I just want everybody to introduce themselves, so we'll get back.
Say again?
Oh, I just wanted everybody to briefly introduce themselves. We'll get back to...
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, we'll circle around back to that and doggone it, happy Halloween.
And then you're a bunch of Batman at the end. Anyways,
Something to do with Batman.
Paul, who are you?
Paul Levitz, and I was 12 in 1968. Sam Moskowitz, who was the great historian of science fiction, came up with the line that the golden age of science fiction is 12. I think that's probably true for most forms of popular culture. That's a kind of perfect age to imprint. So I guess I'm here as a witness to what it was like to be in 1968 and to find it so cool and the damage it did me, so that I spent the rest of my life here. There is a way out someday, right?
Every time you think you're out, they drag you back in.
I haven't yet been able to get to the point of thinking I'm out, just trying to figure out where the exit is sometimes.
Sean Howe, who wasn't even born in 1968.
As Danny just reminded me, I was not technically alive in 1968. I wrote a book called Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, which I think, which I'm pretty sure all the other panelists appear in. If the golden age of reading comics was 12, I was reading all of these people at the golden age of comics.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you, okay. And did I plug, I'm writing a biography of Stan Lee, unauthorized, that will be out sometime next year. And 1968 was a hell of a year in, well, Marvel, Stan, but well, let me explain the 60s to you guys, and so that sort of is part of the contrast, the Crisis on Campus, Spider-Man, Zap, those were some of the various poles of comics. Not unlike, today, the 60s was a highly politicized era. A lot of that focused on the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam, and 1968 might, in some ways, was the apex of that. This is the scene from the Tet Offensive, which was a major event in the Vietnam War, which was controversial, but this really, I think, intensified the anti-war movement in this country. This is again from Tet. It was a surprise attack by the North Vietnamese, and the Americans in the South were not really prepared for it. But it ended up leading to Lyndon Johnson, who was the president who had succeeded John F. Kennedy when he was assassinated, deciding to not run for re-election in '68. And then just to sort of, so this was Martin Luther King, of course, on the left, and he and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in the spring of '68. But just to show how not yesterday this is from today's New York Times. Juan Romero, who aided a dying Robert Kennedy, is dead at 68. So, and there is the guy who Juan Romero, who was a busboy at the hotel where RFK was shot. So I mean, it's literally, this stuff still is very much alive. The era, for numerous reasons all over the world, was filled with would-be revolution, and this is from the streets of Paris. This is the Columbia University campus. Anybody in this room in that picture? It's possible. Nobody. This was the takeover of the various buildings by various factions at Columbia. This was the Democratic Convention in '68. That is Eugene McCarthy, one of the peace candidates in the left. On the right is George McGovern, who would become the candidate in '72. In the center is Hubert Humphrey, who had been a old school, very admired liberal who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's Mayor Daley. That's the very contentious Democratic convention. That's sort of emblematic of the raised tempers and enmity there. Outside, there were demonstrations. Some of them, they started out peacefully. That's Phil Oakes playing for the anti-war demonstrators. It became not so peaceful, and they became the police riots of at night, and the demonstrators, well, there it is. You can see what happened there. That led to 8, later 7 activists being indicted as the Chicago 7, first Chicago 8, and then Chicago 7. Abby Hoffman in the middle. The rest you may recognize. Ultimately, these guys won. Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew. Agnew was convicted. Nixon was not. But enough of the real world. Let's get to. So the pop culture, though. I mean, it's impossible to do the pop culture of the era, and including the comics, without the history. So Hair was a big hit. That was the first Broadway show that had nudity and all the music people know. Elvis came back on TV. Cream went away. That was their farewell tour. Jimi Hendrix put out Electric Ladyland. I'm a Dylan fan, so I'm cheating. That record came out December 27th, 1967, but I think it counts as 68. So, and Dylan went unelectric. That was Dylan going folky. The Jefferson Airplane did Crown of Creation. This is Big Brother and the Holding Company. I originally was going to show the cover to their Cheap Thrills album, but I realized there is a racial caricature on it drawn by Robert Crumb that I did not think would be wise to show in 2018. But this is Big Brother. And we can talk about, I'm sure we will talk about changing attitudes and what constitutes acceptable satire. The band put out their first album with the Dylan painted cover. The Rolling Stones put out Beggar's Banquet. You may think that's so elegant, but the Rolling Stones put out a plain vanilla album, kind of like the Beatles. Well, actually, this was the Rolling Stones, the cover they wanted to put out, but that was too controversial for 1968. And you can see Bob Dylan's dream there of an arrow leading to the toilet. The Beatles went on a Magical Mystery Tour. They put out the White Album, which they were kind enough to provide their fans with photos of themselves. They had Yellow Submarine came out, their movie, so it was a big year for the Beatles. As far as other popular movies, it was I really had an embarrassment of riches to pick out these. The ones that sort of were popular with the counterculture were 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was very psychedelic. This is an early Brian De Palma movie, and that guy on the bottom is Robert De Niro. It's a movie called Greetings. Greetings was in the days of the draft. If you got a letter telling you were drafted, it started Greetings. So that's about Robert De Niro's attempts to avoid being drafted. Head, which starred the Monkees, and as you can see, it's not suitable for children, and yet it was the adorable Monkees, directed by Bob Rafelson. For you Yiddish theater fans, he's I think the nephew of Samson Rafelson, who wrote The Jazz Singer. Wild in the Streets came out, which was ultimately what the kids wanted. They wanted to have the first teenage president to be wild in the streets. They also weren't afraid of a lot of copy. Same year, in less countercultural venues, Clint Eastwood came out with Hang 'em High, The Night of the Living Dead, which started some kind of zombie phenomenon. Planet of the Apes came out that year. And, now we're getting to comics. This is Stanley and Jack Kirby. They were riding high on the Marvel phenomenon. And yet, I think even though they didn't realize it, they maybe had peaked and were sort of on a downward slope, but still doing amazing work. Like the Fantastic Four, this was a four-parter starring the Silver Surfer, who would then launch into his own series, not drawn by Jack Kirby, drawn by John Buscema. So that was, a lot of people think that was part of Kirby deciding to ultimately leave Marvel. Marvel expanded. Marvel was sold for the first time in its history by Martin Goodman to a conglomerate, and they expanded the line. They doubled the line, so suddenly Iron Man got his own comic, and Captain America, and Jim Steranko's Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Guardians of the Galaxy actually first appeared in 1968. And in an attempt to address what the kids were thinking about, Spider-Man had to deal with a crisis on the campus. And also Marvel experimented with some larger format comics like this one that lasted 2 issues. It was more like a Mad Magazine size. Denny, this is Mysterious Suspense up on the, can you see up on the, were you involved with that?
Yeah.
So that was part of, that's Carlton Comics.
Yeah, I may have been. I mean, I did so many odd little jobs for Dick when he had that job. I did Funny Animals and, you name it. So I later had something to do with that character.
Right.
But
Well, that was Steve Ditko.
it was a job, and it still is. I've written 3 comic books in the last month, and that was Once Upon a Time Normal.
Right.
And it's still a job. It's a great job, but it's a job.
All right, so Steve Ditko had left Marvel a couple of years earlier, returned to Carlton. This is Carmine Infantino. He was of course, brilliant artist and designer who went on to become, what was his title? Editor-in-chief, publisher?
He had a bunch of them. Art director, editorial director, publisher, and then president of DC across a span of about 10 years, from roughly end of 66, beginning of 67. I've never quite pinned it down properly, to the beginning of 76.
So he brought in kind of a new sensibility of very designy kind of stuff to, I don't mean that pejoratively, very highly designed covers to try to compete with Marvel, who was gaining on them in the marketplace. Now look, Denny, look who's up on the screen there.
To show you what a hippie I was, that photograph was taken in the living room of a drug dealer. Very good photo, I think. We've done a lot of use of it.
And your son looks just like you. It's kind of amazing.
He wasn't taking that as sort of for his wall of like satisfied customers or anything.
We lived in a very interesting neighborhood. My mother, the one time she came to visit us, cried. A terrible, sordid condition her firstborn was in.
East Village or Lower East Side?
Beg pardon?
What neighborhood was this?
Lower East Side. Yeah. Where all the hippies and
Yeah.
Riff-raff.
So
okay.
Danny, so now this is something you worked on, yes? Or not? That's Steve Skates who did Hawk and Dove that Ditko.
And an angry Steve Ditko.
Yeah. who I think Ditko synthesized more with the Hawk and Skates more with the Dove. Neil Adams broke through on things like Dead Man, and Dead Man was an attempt, I think, by DC to kind of Marvelize themselves and do like offbeat, introspective characters. Danny, was this you, the Creeper, with Ditko?
Yeah, that's my conscience occasionally bothers me because of how many times I have taken something of Steve Ditko's and ruined it. Everything that Steve created was very solemn. He was probably the most ardent Ayn Rand disciple I've ever known. And that was a very solemn character. Well, take a look at him. He's a clown. So I gave him humorous dialogue, and I think Steve could not have been happy about that. I disagree with disagreed. I keep forgetting these people are past tense. We disagreed about everything, but I did respect the fact that he was very sincere in what he did believe. And Len Wein said, with regard to a later character, if you were going to change it that much, why didn't you just create a new character? And it's not a bad question. I was operating out of the way to be a professional that I knew, and it was Paul Levitz gave me the assignment walking back from dinner one night.
To the Creeper?
When you were 12?
No,
I'll acknowledge being precocious, but
no, the question.
oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was the one I did the most
You did beautiful work on
damage
that.
to. But
Wait, some people might think this is the one that you did the most damage.
hey, Danny, I'm old and I'm sick. Will you please take it easy on me?
Look at the screen, I'm gonna put on.
Okay, Danny, I'm not showing up 50 years after some of the things that I'm embarrassed by. So the 2024 convention and the 2025, please don't book me. I'm just sort of telling you in advance.
Okay, I should live so long. But Denny, this is actually, well,
Yeah, that was my version of Wonder Woman. Gloria Steinem, no less a personage than that, attacked me in print. God bless her, she did not use proper nouns in that article. And I don't think she was wrong. She was certainly right from her standpoint. I thought I was married to a really sincere feminist and was, at least on the edges of the peace movement. So I thought, okay, here's a woman whose adventures have not sold very well. Leaving that aside, why don't I, instead of getting her powers handed to her by a male god, let her earn her abilities, and let her, in terms of costume and peripheral stuff, let's make it contemporary. So I did, thinking I was serving the cause of feminism. What I was doing was taking the one really powerful superhero character and weakening her. That's the way the feminists saw it, and I cannot disagree with them. Also, she learned her martial arts from a man, and if that ain't bad enough for you, he was named after one of the 5 great classics of Chinese literature. So I managed to insult the whole.
But I have to say, Danny, recently, there's a whole body of criticism that is extant that says, those stories were pretty good. I mean, so people are reading them now, divorced from the Times, and going, oh yeah, Danny wrote some pretty good stories.
It's a lot better
Yeah,
than
as
the
stories,
immediate
I mean,
preceding.
I don't read printed stuff, but I guess they're okay. A TV producer friend sent me a recording of the movie with Dustin Hoffman. Hey, I'm trying to walk over here. Whoa.
Midnight Cowboy. Midnight Cowboy.
Midnight Cowboy, and there is a shot in there of one of those two guys with that comic book reading it. I have my very own special break into the big time. It was only big time for about 11 seconds, but we took what we got back then.
And Danny, of course, you also worked on Justice League and of course Batman. I mean, this is any thoughts on Justice League?
Yeah, it's a tough one to write, and it's one of only 3 assignments that I ever bailed on. Here's my problem with superheroes. It's hard to plot for them and still maintain narrative consistency, because you put Superman against a pickpocket or your average mad scientist even. Who's going to win? Where is the conflict coming in that? And as a former boss of mine, after Paul, constantly reminded us there has to be conflict in a story. Didn't agree with him about much, but you knew, did you mention that name?
I said, no, I said, so I've heard.
Yes, well. Anyway, the Justice League, you had 3 gods and then a bunch of guys who were really pretty strong, you know, they could bench press. So after a year and a half, I thought, my God, I'm about to do another alien invasion in order to give these characters something that'll give them 10 seconds problem. And later with Superman, it was much the same thing. And Julie did allow me to drastically reduce his powers. One of my favorite bad example of Superman stories is when he blew out a sun. Well, okay, you're gonna create conflict for this guy, Howe? I mean, you know, Moses and those guys didn't have that much power. So I was always looking for, can I do this when offered something? And can I do it without driving myself crazy? I mean, I'm a human being, I have a family. And that's, Paul, when he offered me the question, was at the same time offered me Captain Atom. And my problem with Captain Atom is he's Superman. He is too damn powerful for, I am not a good enough writer to create interesting conflicts for somebody who is so powerful. And there, you asked for it, Daniel, and you got it.
Oh my God, and I stand accommodated.
I'm a veteran.
Anyway, so in the era, in the 68, there were a lot, just, you know, we're focusing for obvious reasons on Marvel, DC, and the undergrounds, but there were a ton of companies and a ton of comics, so that Harvey Comics was still putting out Richie Rich and everybody else. Archie and me, they were addressing the kids too. There's a principal, Mr. Witherby, he's trying to measure the generation gap, so Archie was right up there and keeping up with, but I mean, there were tons and tons of comics adaptations, and just as a brief plug, and I should, you know, because this is Will Eisner, who was a major figure, and 68 was sort of an interim year for him, but there'll be a panel at 11 a.m. tomorrow talking about Will Eisner right in this room, so, but Eisner in those years was still putting out PS Magazine, telling you how to take care of your M16A1 rifle. Someone, Dennis, do you know who had licensed the Spirit newspaper strips to put out these?
That was Ken Pierce.
Ken Pierce. So there was the Spirit. You know, Pfeiffer had brought back attention to the Spirit in the great comic book hero. So Will was sort of starting to learn about the modern comic world. And this is Wally Wood's Wit's End comic, which actually came out in '69, but there was a pivotal interview with Eisner called Having Something to Say that was done by John Benson in '68, that appeared in this, and it's reprinted, you can find it online. It's a terrific and very kind of seminal interview. And then there were the Undergrounds. The Undergrounds have been appearing in newspapers and newspapers and as posters, and Crumb finally put together Zap Comics. Dennis, do you have a little history you can sort of fill in on the origins of the Underground?
Well, the origins of the Underground?
Not you, Dennis. Dennis.
This
No,
Dennis?
the other
That Dennis?
yeah, okay.
The young Dennis.
Well, basically, you saw the photos of the political tumult that was going on in the country. My generation was the first to grow up with kind of a sense of comic book history. We were the first to probably, because fanzines were starting to emerge, we knew a little bit about what came before. I know I was intensely curious. At the same time, I was frustrated that the Comic Code Authority was still in force, so all the comics had to be censored essentially. And I was old enough that I remembered the pre-code comics when I was growing up, and I saw how different they became in the mid-50s. And the guys who were approximately my age and politically active cartoonists basically simultaneously in all corners of the country started doing what later became underground comics. When I did my first comic, I began drawing it in 1968. I had no idea Crumb was creating Zap Comics. When mine came out, I self-published it. I think you have a slide.
Yeah. The slide you were showing, by the way, you were showing Trash Man and...
Yeah, that's Bain Rodriguez, Gilbert Shelton, who did Freak Brothers. Were kind of the...
And
that's me. If I don't look like a hippie there, I had just gotten out of the Army. I had spent 22 days in the Army. Another story for
How
another
did you
day.
manage that?
Another story, another time. The subtitle of Mom's Homemade Comics was a silly title to set up the subtitle, which was Straight from the Kitchen to You. So I had an instinct for getting publicity early on, and so that was me taking these out of the oven where they had just been baked. So I started that in 1968, and
So this, any
That's
story,
it.
two of your one-pagers here,
okay.
On the Loose with Dr. Seuss and Slum Tourism. I mean, where did those come from?
On the Loose with Dr. Seuss is pretty recent.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah.
never mind. Okay. Well then, how
But
about
yeah,
Slum
that was actually in Mom's #1, and so again, it's satire. So I'm making fun of the fact that I think it's self-explanatory. There's a fisherman who just caught a rat. Shoe Shine Boy says, "Shine 'em, boss," and the woman says, "Isn't that cute?" You know. So basically, the underground comics were a reaction to a number of things, partly the politics in the country, but also to the comic book industry itself. We decided unilaterally we did not want to sell our work on a work-for-hire basis. We didn't want to give up our copyright. We didn't want to do the superhero comics, even though I have to say all of us probably grew up loving them. It's just not what we wanted to do. We wanted to express ourselves, sometimes first person or through characters. And so it was a watershed moment for us personally, because it wasn't a regular gig. We didn't get paid on Friday. But we did set up the underground comics business in as egalitarian a manner as we could. So instead of getting paid a flat rate, the underground artists got a royalty based on a percentage of the sales, own the copyright, own their original art, all the things that at that time the mainstream comics business did not do. So it thrived for quite a while. Surprisingly, we distributed not through normal newsstands. You couldn't find us in drugstore newsstands, but we were mostly distributed through head shops, which were another part of the counterculture, where you went to get your rolling papers and bongs and psychedelic posters. There would be a rack or two of comics. And they sold surprisingly well. Some of the comics minimally sold 10,000, and the best ones sold in 6 figures. So it was actually a thriving enterprise.
Wasn't that sort of the beginning of the direct market, or the beginnings of it?
It was. Phil Suling based his model on what we were doing, only he did it with mainstream comics, and
We can debate
Paul
that.
gave one of these.
We can debate that.
yeah, we can do it.
I've been arguing that with Mr. Beerbaum for quite a number
Let's
of
do a
years.
panel on it.
That would be a fun one.
Sean, you've been very politely listening, but obviously something about, right, you did a history of Marvel, a lot of it about the 60s to the 80s, but your current project is very much about the 60s, right? About
the underground press.
the underground press. So what, as a scholar and fan, and what's your take? And yet someone was looking at it, you know, as something from literally before you were born. What was going on then in your, you know, studies and reading? And
Well,
writing?
you know, one thing that I was just thinking about is how, from my perspective, it seems like the underground comics and the more mainstream comics did not really mix in the way, the movies that kind of changed things in 1968 were studio movies. And the music that was, considered revolutionary in 1968 was largely put out by major labels. But in comics, it seemed like they were really, either parallel paths or maybe even just diverging paths. And I actually was curious what the other panelists thought of that. Did it seem like, the audiences overlapped much? Did it seem like there was much, were the underground artists paying much attention to the current superhero comics and vice versa?
Well, the world was ripe for change. I mean, the conditions evolved so that Dennis could do the underground stuff. We did some socially conscious stuff for the mainstream. Wouldn't have been possible 10 years earlier. One of the things that I find discouraging is there were real lessons you could learn from that. One of them is the people, the conservatives, the church-going middle America don't accomplish anything. They just keep reiterating what has been accomplished. It's the one, always, in science, in music, what is considered radical is eventually what becomes the norm. And look at our political situation. Nobody has learned a goddamn thing from that culture-wide phenomenon.
I'm going to have to defer to Dennis about whether the underground cartoonists were still reading the mainstream comics. But you have to remember that at that time, virtually all the mainstream comics were intended for an audience that dead-ended at about 12. So there were only a handful of odd people. I was still only 12, but I would be an odd person a moment later, who would hang with those titles a little bit longer. There were a few kids on college campuses. Stan particularly was starting to try to market to that a little bit. But probably 90% of the audience for the traditional mainstream comics were kids who wouldn't be allowed anywhere where an underground comic was sold. Once in a while, I'm sure one of the more precocious ones managed to find their way into a head shop or managed to get a hold of their older brother's copy. But the disconnect was a very bright line. Children and not children. And that barrier was much firmer in the pre-internet years than it is today. Once we had the internet, once a child was old enough to have access to a computer in the family, nanny settings or otherwise aside, a reasonably smart kid could get access to anything in the world, literally. Stuff that their mother and father would absolutely wish them not to be seeing. But in 1968, in most communities, a child had no access to anything their parents didn't approve of. And there weren't a lot of parents who would have been approving of the undergrounds. The hippie generation hadn't started having kids yet.
Well, who was reading the Marvel comics? A lot of rock musicians, a lot of acid rock musicians were reading Marvel comics. I mean, that's the number of times Country Joe and the Fish went to visit Stan Lee at Marvel Comics, who had no idea who they were.
Somebody over the weekend in another state pointed out to me that you cannot read Vonnegut if you're stoned. You can read comic books if you're stoned. The medium is congenial.
Well, they were convinced that Stan and Jack, and especially Steve, were tripping their minds out, even though these guys were the last people in the world to... They didn't need it. Maybe this is a although Denny, I think of you as a crossover figure, as somebody who existed and who had friends in Bohemia and in the underground, and yet also worked in the mainstream. I see you as almost a linking figure.
Well, I should point out that although I have mentioned drugs several times, I am marijuana proof because I don't like it. We really did live above drug dealers, and I really didn't like it. Yeah, here's why I think that happened. Most of the people who came into the business at that point had been fans. That meant that they knew what comics were. The same way with creative people. I can remember editorial meetings at which it was, hypothesized that they don't know how to do comics down at Marvel. The old crowd, even though they may have been teenagers, knew what comics were and they knew how to do those comics. I didn't have any of that baggage. I saw it as a really interesting medium. I saw it, I was a rebel back then. I went on the peace marches and so on, and I saw that there a chance to be a rebel and still feed my family, which was always my first consideration. So having your cake and eat it too, I just saw it from my very first meetings with Roy Thomas. It looked like we could do more. And then I worked with one of the great Zen editors, Julie Schwartz, who would not have identified with being Zen. But unlike other editors I have encountered over the years, he didn't care about his own ego. He cared about the story we were trying to tell and how well can we tell it. And did not want any credit and never took any credit for anything that everybody else did. The other reinventor of comics was Stan, who went the opposite way and gave letterers and colorists an identity and emphasized. It was a very bogus creation, the bullpen. It was never really like that, and Stan was not a hippie by any stretch. Flo Steinberg tells the story of when I had a "Let's Legalize Pot" button on my jacket. And Stan came into the office and he, what are we wearing today? And his face dropped and he said, listen, if you're gonna work for me, there's certain things you gotta give up, and that's one of them. And he tore it off and left 4 people, what just happened? The irony being, of course, that I had access to a lot of grass and I didn't bother to pick it up.
I think you told me.
Show on the microphone.
I think, Denny, didn't you tell me a story about someone trying to persuade you to spike Stanley's drink?
I can't think of that guy's name. He later created a small reputation.
Was it Julius Siegel? Was it Julius Siegel?
Might have been. Yeah, he was a rebel who worked on what they themselves called the sweat magazines. Sergeant Rocksmith from Brooklyn takes out a Japanese company with a cigarette lighter and a cute blonde. Those guys made a sprint for the bar every night at 5 o'clock. They were really bright guys. One of them was Francis Ford Coppola.
No, Mario Puzo.
Mario Puzo, and a lot of lesser names.
Puzo and
Bruce J. Friedman.
Bruce Friedman, yeah, he was the great black humorist for a while. Excuse me. So what was I saying?
You were wrapping up to this great story about the decision of whether or not to spike.
Oh yeah, Jules Siegel, a young, hip guy, wanted me to spike Stanley's coffee with LSD. I was not so dumb even then as to allow myself to be enlisted in this. I'm sure nobody here has ever experimented with LSD, because you know we're Christians here, those of us.
Excuse me?
Yes,
And Stan was a really straight guy. I mean, you know, let's legalize pot and some other stuff that people would call, and they would be teenage drug users who would say, "What? Can you tell me what Stan and Steve Ditko take before they write Dr. Strange?" And I said, if there are two guys on the island of Manhattan less likely to use drugs than the two guys you've mentioned, especially not Steve, I don't know who they are.
I'm not sure I ever saw Steve drinking coffee. I'm not sure I even saw Steve drinking coffee over the years.
Yeah, what a deeply unhappy man. I didn't mean that as funny. I mean, he lived alone. He was often angry. His Bible were those middle 40 pages or so of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, where John Galt goes on the radio all over the world at once and tells people the truth. He would feel kind of comfortable in today's politics. Anyway, that's the story of my being enlisted to really probably drive Stan over the edge.
What if he enjoyed it? So we have some questions. There's a mic there. Anybody have any questions? Yes. Can you go back, Frank? Can you go to the microphone? And anybody else has one, line up behind Frank, please.
It's a great panel so far. Dennis, this is for you, the young Dennis. What do you remember about Comix book? There was an attempt at Marvel to do underground comics, and apparently the contributors would not do work for hire. They wanted their copyrights to be given.
Well, yeah, it's funny, coming off how straight Stan was, he was hip enough in a business sense. He had been doing the college campus tour, and you know, he wanted to be hip and with it. So he reached out to me. We had been pen pals, oddly enough, from the first time Mom's #1 came out. And so he basically said he would give me an opportunity to put together a magazine with the underground cartoonists. And it came just at the time when the undergrounds were experiencing what we call the crash of '73, which was a coincidence of Supreme Court ruling on obscenity, which threw it into the local neighborhoods to decide.
Sean was almost born then.
And at the same time, there was a glut in the market because we sold on a non-returnable basis. A lot of the head shops who didn't order knowing that, say, Zap would sell better than Googie Wommer, ended up with a lot of Googie Wommers in the racks, and they slowed down their sales. So we were in a genuine crisis economically. And then when Stan said, "Will you work for me?" I said, "Let's talk." So I went to New York, and basically we worked out a pretty interesting arrangement where he let me edit a magazine and stay in Wisconsin where I was. I didn't at that time have any interest in moving east. Gave me a very nice budget that allowed the artists to make about 4 times what they were in the undergrounds. And he basically said, you know, try to avoid the nudity and the 4-letter words and so on. And we pushed those rules as hard as we could, and some surprisingly raw stuff got in there. And mostly he gave us newsstand distribution, which meant that for the first time, a lot of people could see these artists who otherwise you could only find in a head shop. So we all rationalized it, and it worked out well in the end, even though by the time the 3rd issue came out, we found out that Stan was getting a lot of pushback from the bullpen. Basically, it amounted to, why are you giving these long-haired guys their art back and allowing them to keep their copyright and treating them differently than us? And Stan didn't have a quick answer. So basically he called me and said, I'm pulling the rug on this. Before we even really had good sales numbers back. So he put himself in kind of a political fix, oddly enough. But it saved my business, and it allowed people like Trina and others to make down payments on houses. So, in retrospect, an odd experience. I have, we collected that Best of the Comics book a couple of years ago, so there's a book out.
Where might people find it at the convention then?
Well, the table G2 and G3 in Artist Alley would have some copies.
Thank you. Next.
Hi. So I wonder if you have any thoughts, the whole panel, about how your comic books started as like topping out at 12, whereas now they're kind of like, seems like they're focused on adult audiences, and how the seeds of like mature, more, socially conscious work has kind of gone into something that's almost like gratuitous at times,
Well,
like
he-
really violent.
He forgot his fig leaf that day. That's why we have.
The most successful comics of the last 4 or 5 years are Raina Telgemeier's graphic novels, which I'm not sure top out at 12, but 13 maybe. I mean, they're definitely kid oriented. We didn't have successful kids comics for probably about a 20-year stretch there, but the kids graphic novel has really revitalized that and become a really interesting category. I think most of the countries that have large and successful comics worlds, whether you call them manga, you call them bande dessinée, you call them comics, doesn't matter, produce stuff for all ages and all interests. And in America, for a variety of business reasons, we were producing only a couple of flavors. And we'll be doing considerably better, and I think continuing to do better and better in the next few years as we offer more stuff. Are there comics out there that are too violent for my taste, or too sexual for my taste, or too young for my taste? Sure. But I shouldn't like everything. I should like some stuff. I don't have to read every comic book that's published.
There are probably novels out there that you don't like, and
Quite a few, actually. And also remember that when we're talking about 1968, I think there's 2 things you ought to really remember that we haven't touched on at all, that I think go to your point sideways. One is that in an average month in 1968, between the undergrounds and the mainstream, there were maybe 150 comics published, something like that in the country. Now we have weeks and there were no graphic novels, so that was the totality of comics beyond the newspaper comic strips. Now we have weeks where there are 700 comics published in an individual week, so much more diverse. Also, the mainstream comics community in 1968, every creator who was creating mainstream comics could fit in this room with chairs to spare. And I'm not as familiar to be able to do a body count on the undergrounds, but I suspect if we tossed them in, they'd still fit in the room. So you had this just incredibly small community of people, and that was part of the limitation of the process too. Yeah, we have stuff that any of us don't like in any given direction at this point, but we also have several thousand people creating comics, and that creates a just enormously wide variety of taste. They don't have to like what I write. Most of them don't.
as long as they pay for it.
They don't do that. They don't do that either, Denny.
Okay, time for 1 or 2 more. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I was just wondering, I don't think there's necessarily any sort of comics movement now that necessarily equates to like the underground comics, but I noticed like a lot of, especially with things like Kickstarter, on the internet, a lot of people self-publishing comics and kind of doing that, and actually like getting like funded books or through a smaller publisher, actually getting them into comic shops. And like, how do you think the direct market has really had an effect on like smaller kind of publishers that would have only been in like a head shop back in the day, and how do you think that's really not only affected it, but maybe hurt it in some ways?
There's a lot of stuff being published today that sells at the levels that fanzines used to. Not even the level the undergrounds did. Some of it is really wonderful stuff. Changes in distribution are part of changes in technology. You know, it used to be very expensive to make the printing plates necessary to even make a black and white underground, and a color comic had tremendous cost before you started the first copy on the press. So it was, you could see that the undergrounds, even though they printed in black and white, typical price was probably $2.
50 cents
50
in the day.
cents.
Yeah.
So 4 times the price of a color comic, because the circulation was so much less. They just, in most cases. I
And
mean,
it costs more to take the color out, too.
You got to remember, a dime bag costs $10 then too.
and the current price, Dennis, that you're quoting? Just checking.
Somebody gave me a bowl full of marijuana for Christmas. And I spent the next month in a hospital recovery room.
No connection, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no connect. No, I'm a good boy. I'm a Catholic boy.
Not this Christmas, then.
Oh, here's
the past
one
Christmas.
addendum to what Paul was saying. Back then, some of the underground guys gave me grief over the fact that I was doing superheroes. I think the reality, you guys could speak to this, is that without the superheroes, you wouldn't have had the undergrounds, because they supported the comic shops, which gave you guys a venue to sell your wares. We don't have Saturday Evening Post anymore, because all those slick magazines that my mom read when I was 6 didn't have a way to survive a publishing implosion. They didn't have the equivalent of the comic shop where, you know, you could go and buy the Saturday Evening Post.
Yeah, I would agree with Denny that at the time the direct market was evolving, it saved the undergrounds because the head shops were coming under a lot of local pressure and were disappearing. So we made that transition and it allowed us to survive. But back then there was a lot less competition. Today, excuse me, the comic shops have such a tremendous choice, like Paul said. It's so hard if you're a retailer to figure out what to put in your store, what fits, what's going to sell. So now, ironically, I think it's a deterrent to the small press because most shops won't take a chance on it. So it's come full circle from being a salvation to now being a problem. So other than other business models like Kickstarter and internet sales and things that bypass shops, it's not a good time to be doing small press in that sense.
As Dick used to say, comics don't have to be magazine format. I think the characters will be around in 10 years. I'm not sure the little magazine format that Bill Gaines devised in 1938 will survive. I mean, there are very few magazines that aren't niche magazines published at all anymore. No general interest stuff is available.
We have run out of time. So I want to thank these wonderful panelists. Young Dennis, your table. What's your table?
Oh,
What table are you at in North Stanley?
G2.
Go visit it, it's great.
And I am at B13, and these other guys are not tabling. They're too good for us, but no, they're smart. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, audience. Come back tomorrow, 11 a.m. for the Eisner and the graphic novel explosion. Thank you.